This is a download from the BBC. It's from our own correspondent. We make one version of the programme for the BBC World Service, but this is the latest edition broadcast on BBC Radio 4. It's introduced by Kate Adie.
Hello. Today, how times change. Moscow invites our correspondent to inspect Russia's military operation in Syria. In Vietnam, the old men of the party cling on to power, but the challenges they face are piling up. An African refugee camp the size of Coventry. Could facilities like this soon be springing up on the edges of Europe? And as austerity anger gathers pace in Greece, we head off into the mountains of Crete, looking for lunch. Talks aimed at finding a way of ending the war in Syria are due to get underway in Geneva tomorrow. The nearly 5-year conflict has killed 250,000 people and displaced millions of others. Russia, which has denied a report that it's offered a safe haven for the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, has been lobbying hard ahead of the gathering in Switzerland, suggesting which parties should be allowed to attend and which shouldn't. It's now 4 months since Russia stepped up its military intervention in Syria, with airstrikes and a build-up of troops. Steve Rosenberg spent last week alongside Russian forces operating there and learned something of Moscow's intentions.
If there is one thing that working in Russia teaches you, it is patience. 4 years ago, I tried to arrange a meeting with officials from the Russian Defense Ministry's press office to introduce myself as Moscow correspondent and to let them know that the BBC was keen to make some reports about the Russian army. So I telephoned the press department and explained my idea. "Please send an official request by fax," replied a distinctly unenthusiastic voice. So I did. And then I waited and waited. From time to time, I called back to try to find out when, if ever, this elusive meeting would take place. But it never did. After 12 months, I realised it never would. By that point, it had become clear that as Russia's relations with the West were deteriorating, reaching out to Western media was not a priority for the Russian military. Last week, I remembered this fruitless fax and all those unsuccessful telephone calls as I stood beside the runway of Russia's Khmeimim airbase in Syria. And it suddenly occurred to me how much things had changed. This time, it was the Russian army which had telephoned us and invited us on a trip to Syria, to the heart of Russia's military operation. We were part of a group of international journalists given a 3-day tour of western Syria and granted rare access to the Russian military. On the airbase, we were allowed to film the most advanced Russian fighter jets preparing for their missions. As the bombers powered down the runway and soared into the air, there was a deafening roar. One Russian officer suggested that during the takeoffs we keep our mouths open to stop our eardrums from bursting. We were shown Russian soldiers loading bombs onto a Sukhoi 34 jet. Precision weapons for targeting terrorists, the Russians told us. Western governments are not convinced by the word precision or by the word terrorist. Recently, the British Defence Secretary claimed that unguided Russian munitions in Syria had killed hundreds of civilians. The Foreign Secretary has gone even further, suggesting that Russia has been deliberately targeting schools, hospitals and rescue workers in Syria, and that Moscow should be held accountable for this under international law. I asked the spokesman for the Russian Defence Ministry to respond to these accusations. "No one has ever presented any proof, any evidence of this," Major General Igor Konashenkov told me. "And what is more, no army in the world has ever been so open about who it's targeting. It's terrorists we're attacking, their command posts and their infrastructure." "Are you saying," I responded, "that after nearly 6,000 sorties by your Air Force, there hasn't been one civilian casualty?" "Correct," replied the spokesman. Major General Konashenkov was our principal guide during this unusual tour. He was always happy to answer our questions. What he wouldn't do, though, was tell us in advance where he was going to take us or what he was going to show us. "The less you know beforehand," he explained, "the safer you'll be." That is why, at times, being embedded with the Russian military felt like some kind of magical mystery tour. One morning, our press bus drove south along the Latakia coast to Tartus, where Russia has a naval facility. It's not a fully fledged base, more a repair yard and supply station for warships. But this is Russia's only outlet to the Mediterranean, and as such, one reason why Syria is so important to Moscow. We boarded an anti-submarine destroyer called the Vice Admiral Kulakov and set sail. The commander, a jovial captain called Stanislav Varik, showed off his ship's torpedoes, its anti-submarine missiles, and the 100mm naval cannon. As we looked out to sea, a Russian guided missile cruiser sailed into view. And it was at this point I suddenly realised the message that the Russian military was trying to send by bringing us to Syria and by giving us unprecedented access to its operations. That message is much wider than simply Russia is fighting international terrorism. It's a statement to the West that with all these fighter jets and warships and torpedoes in the Mediterranean, Russia sees itself, once again, as a major player on the world stage.
That's Steve Rosenberg, now back in Moscow. Vietnam has a new leader. Loyal Communist Party stalwart Nguyen Phu Trong was selected at the 5-yearly Congress in the capital Hanoi yesterday. In the run-up to the meeting, there'd been fierce political infighting as the country's modernising Prime Minister made a bid for the top job. But the Central Committee decided against him, preferring instead his more conservative rival. Jonathan Head says Vietnam's rulers will now try to continue with economic reforms, but difficulties lie ahead.
Tueng Ye is one of the faces of modern Vietnam. Glamorously well-dressed, though shivering in the unusually cold weather in Hanoi, far to the north of her home in tropical Ho Chi Minh City, she told me a bit of her life story. As a child, she watched her parents' business fail, and they had to move to a small house outside the city. At the age of 15, she started her own small business, she told me, and today at just 22, her company has a £1 million property portfolio. She promotes herself relentlessly on social media, and her recently published book of tips on life and love sold 10,000 copies in 3 days. She is a role model for many young Vietnamese, and about as far removed as you can get from the Communist Party elders who were holding a congress to choose new leaders just a few minutes' drive from where we were speaking. And yet it is the old men of the party who still hold all the power in Vietnam, not its rising entrepreneurs. Does that bother her? I don't really care who the top leaders will be, she told me. The next generation will be much the same as now. All I care about is that they keep bringing benefits to the people. 2/3 of this country's population was born after the Vietnam War ended in 1975. To them, it's distant history, not the life and death struggle cited by the party as justification for its monopoly on power. Ask young Vietnamese about politics from which they're essentially excluded, and you get an instant shrug of the shoulders. Their real concern over this Congress, they told me, was the traffic jams caused by the comings and goings of the dignitaries. The formula of letting the party rule unopposed and letting the rest of the population get richer has worked pretty well for Vietnam over 2 decades. But it is looking increasingly threadbare. This party congress is a case in point. Normally, all the important decisions are made secretly well in advance. But that didn't happen this year. The contest for the top job in the Communist Party went right up to the wire, even as the 1,500 delegates knuckled down to their deliberations. Ever since the death of founding father Ho Chi Minh in 1969, the Communist Party has rejected personality politics and relied on colourless collective leadership. But over the past 10 years, Prime Minister Nguyen Thanh Dung has promoted himself as the architect of Vietnam's impressive economic development and as a man willing to stand up to its giant neighbour China. Mr. Dung is no angel and no Democrat. His family has become very wealthy, and he's not shied away from using state repression against dissidents. But he is as close to a popular leader as we've seen recently. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to has quietly told me they would have preferred him to get the top job. Had he succeeded, he would have become very powerful indeed. Conservatives, led by the current party leader, skillfully used the Byzantine internal workings of the Congress to sideline him. His political career is now over, with not even a ripple of protest, besides the angry pages of social media. Because all this was happening behind closed doors, it's hard to guess why Mr. Zung frightened the Conservatives so much. Perhaps it was his vaulting ambition, or concern over the country's headlong rush into a capitalist world of trade, or perhaps fear that his economic reforms might morph into political ones. They aren't saying. But Vietnam's communists are students of history, and the older ones used to be very close to Russia. They remember the example of Mikhail Gorbachev, a committed communist who initiated his perestroika reforms in the 1980s in the belief that they would revive the Soviet Communist Party. Within 3 years, both the Soviet Union and the party had collapsed. They also remember how China, a successful economy, crushed protesters at Tiananmen Square and got away with it. Possibly they saw in Mr. Zung a potential Gorbachev. But they now have a very difficult path to tread. Younger Vietnamese expect the fast-growing opportunities they've experienced in recent years to continue, and they're accustomed to far more freedom outside politics than their parents had. They're avid consumers of technology and social media. The party may now choose to slow down Mr. Zung's reforms and get even tougher with dissenters. But that poses risks to the economic success, which is now the real source of its legitimacy.
Jonathan Head in Hanoi. The sort of mass movement of people which Europe's been seeing in recent times is no stranger to Africa. Millions of people all over the continent have been displaced. In many cases, they'll never return home. Back in 1991, a temporary refugee camp was set up in the desert in northeastern Kenya. In the 25 years which followed, a drought and then a war against the Islamist fighters of Al-Shabaab brought hundreds of thousands to Dadaab, as it's called. Alistair Leithhead has been to this, the largest refugee camp in the world, to talk to some who were born there and others who never expect to leave.
From the top of one of the towering metal water tanks that punctuate the flat, sprawling landscape, you can see the dust devils sucking up the fine sand, swirling around the fringes of the camp. The sun glints off the corrugated iron roofs of each little temporary house made of mud or wood or scrap metal. Some are just tents, a patchwork of material, shredded by the strong winds that sweep the camp, sandblasting everything and everybody. Several are held together by tarpaulins, emblazoned with the name of the aid agency that provided them. Each plot is surrounded by the desert's natural barbed wire, a picket fence made out of dried thorn branches, tied tightly together, their long white needles keeping intruders out. This is not a safe place to live. Rape, robbery, and violence are common in the camp. We travel in armoured cars with armed police. The Dust Bowl used to be a forest. Some trees remain, giving welcome shade, but most were either lost to firewood or now make up the barriers around the homes. The 350,000 people who currently live here, and that's the equivalent of a city the size of Coventry, are not forced to stay under this harsh and unforgiving sun, unable to work, living off handouts of food aid. The few who do leave head home, and home is Somalia. But most aren't ready to give up what little they have, to travel back into the unknown. One of the exceptions is Gamana Salat. She's 39 and arrived here aged 14, a quarter of a century ago, when the civil war in her home country pushed the first long line of desperate people west into Kenya. Drought and the conflict against the Islamists of Al-Shabaab have forced many to follow in their footsteps. We met Gamana sheltering under a tent, trying to gather her 7 children together amid the 200 or so people waiting for the buses to come and take them back to Somalia. All of her children were born here. Not one of them has ever left the camp. Life used to be pretty good, she told me, but now there's less food. 20 kilos of maize a month is not enough to feed 7 children. The aid agencies have reduced the amount of food rations given to each person, because the money has been diverted to help desperate people elsewhere in the world. She insisted she knew what she was going back to, what it was going to be like now in the Somali port city of Kismayo, where she's from. Her mother and father both died there. She has no relatives left, and the family's land was almost certainly taken by someone else decades ago. But she has a noble ambition, to go to work for my children, she said. Change their lives, but also work for the country, to invest in it with my own strength. Somalia may be taking small steps towards stability, but there's still widespread poverty, and the Al-Shabaab insurgency shows no sign of ending soon. Boarding one of those beaten-up buses and heading off to the border and to whatever lies beyond is riskier than remaining a refugee. Here in the camp there is at least basic health care. Some aid is now handed over in cash so people can buy a little of what they want, rather than just take what they're given. There's also education in Dadaab. But what's the point of that if there are no jobs to go to, only a small chance of being resettled in the West, and little hope of being allowed to live in Kenya outside the camp, to study, work and live in the country where many were born? After every terror attack in Kenya, there's pressure on them to leave. The camp is blamed for being an easy way in for Al-Shabaab militants and a fertile recruiting ground. This may be an exaggeration, but it helps support a policy of segregation, of non-integration, and keeps these people trapped in a limbo that for many has lasted their whole lifetime. With millions of migrants and refugees on the move, you can't help thinking if similar camps may soon spring up as a temporary solution on the edges of Europe. Places of refuge, where people can be given food and shelter, where they can bring up children, and maybe have to live out the rest of their lives.
Alistair Leithhead back now at his base in Nairobi. Hardly a day goes by without another reminder in the news that Germany has taken in more than 1 million foreign migrants in the past year. Usually now it's a story about how Germany's coming to regret its open-door policy. Sometimes it's about the hospitality of Germans volunteering to help the newcomers. But the fact the migrants are there is no accident. Most economists agree that in the long term, Germany needs massive immigration if it's to remain Europe's most successful economy. And in the short term, 1 million extra people create a very healthy demand for goods and services. Paul Henley has been to Munich to meet some of those happy to make money out of the migrants.
Raphael Hock is one of life's optimists. He has reason to be. At 22, he is fit, highly qualified, bilingual, drives a smart car, is fresh back from a skiing holiday in the Alps, and is heir to a multi-million euro family business. Raphael is driving me past whitewashed mansions among the birch trees of Grunwald on the southern outskirts of Munich. We're in the most prosperous part of one of the most prosperous cities on earth. These houses, with their pools and barbecue decks, belong to bosses of famous manufacturing firms and to football players of Bayern Munich. But even this neighbourhood has had to bunk up a little to accommodate some of the hundreds of thousands of penniless migrants who've just arrived. We've just visited a so-called care dome there, one of 15 around the city owned by Raphael's company and leased to the local government. It's an inflatable hall the size of an Olympic swimming pool, housing 300 men from Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan and West Africa, who crossed much of the Middle East and southern Europe to get here. They stay for free in warm bunk rooms, eat 3 meals a day, play table tennis, get pocket money, and wait for news of their asylum claims. Raphael, as you'll have gathered, is no charity worker. Along with many entrepreneurs like him, he's part of what the German papers are calling the refugee industry. He used to provide accommodation for sports clubs, but he diversified in a hurry. And it's paying. He predicts a €37 million annual turnover for his company within 2 years. And like him, the German government is opportunist. It could be said to have seen a gap in the market and decided to fill it. I remember a Spartan day room in a care home in Wittenberg in former East Germany 10 years ago, and a 90-year-old woman singing the saddest of songs about her friends getting old and dying. I was making a documentary about what the country called its demographic time bomb. I talked to politicians about Germany's ageing population, its dramatically low birth rate, and the looming disaster of a future lack of young tax-paying workers to keep the country viable. At the time, the economy was still struggling with the effects of reunification, and unemployment was at a 70-year high. Any suggestion that Germany's solution could be mass immigration would have been greeted with laughter, and who would want to come here? I've never met Angela Merkel, not for want of trying, but she doesn't strike me as a person prone to acts of selfless charity. I imagine she's heard the predictions that in the short term, extra demand for goods and services from 1 million newcomers could give the German economy a bounce of up to 2% a year. And I expect she's heard predictions that in the long term, lots of youthful foreign workers, once educated, trained and taught German, of course, could be the country's economic saviours. A man in a Hugo Boss suit said to me in a cosy office of a think tank near Berlin's Brandenburg Gate that there were no fiscal arguments against the migrants, just political ones. So don't be surprised by the fact that Germany's powerful and business-minded tabloid press are still on side with the refugee project, or that the police in Cologne were reluctant to admit asylum seekers were among those accused of now infamous assaults in a crowd on New Year's Eve. But don't underestimate either the extraordinary goodwill and generosity of Germans still volunteering in their millions to show that their country is a humane destination for the desperate. Among those I met, a single mother who invites homeless Syrians to sleep on her sofa every night, and a retired school teacher who spends 6 days a week introducing sub-Saharan Africans to German grammar. And maybe there's a big divide between them and Raphael Hoch and the millions he's making selling refugee accommodation to the government. But I'd warmed to him even before I found out that he'd personally painted the flower stencils on the grey corridors of his care dome, before he'd mentioned that his girlfriend was a Kosovan Muslim, before he'd promised to change the catering company when 2 Afghan men complained they were sick of spaghetti. Raphael told me Germany not only needed its refugees, it also had a once-in-a-lifetime chance to define itself by the way it treated them. I don't know whether opportunistic, rich Raphael best sums up modern Germany's steely pragmatism or its warm-hearted humanity, but I think there's a healthy dose of both in a country that's opened its doors to 1 million strangers pretty much overnight.
And that's Paul Henley. Farmers, lawyers, journalists, hospital workers, fishermen, ferry crews, they've all been protesting about the Greek government's austerity measures. With a general strike due next week, the problems are piling up for the Greek Prime Minister, Alexis Tsipras. More than a quarter of the country's population is now unemployed. Pensioners have been hit hard. Their income's been cut a dozen times as the government tries to reach economic targets set by the EU and the International Monetary Fund. Heidi Fuller-Love's been to the island of Crete to see how some are coping there.
We've been friends for several months before Yorgos invited me to join him on one of his food foraging expeditions. It was a real honour to be invited. I knew it was an honour because of the way my 80-year-old friend issued the terse invitation. "Θα πάμε να ψάχνουμε χόρτα. Come with me, let's go foraging." He said it in the commanding way that hospitable Cretans do when they give you something, but they don't want the giving to be acknowledged. It was also daring of him to share his secret spots. I knew this too, because he issued the gruff invitation in the street outside his house and not in the Cafenean, that social meeting space where every event of village life is discussed, to the tic-tac tune of Tavli backgammon counters and evil spirit countering Komboloi worry beads. This meant that he didn't want anyone else to hear. People often tend to forget that Greece has only known wealth for the past 30 or 40 years. The wonders of fat-tired four-wheel drives, linoleum on the kitchen floor and self-cleaning ovens are relatively new in this country. Just 70 years ago there was widespread famine, so it's hardly surprising then that the sites where you can find the wild greens that people survived on not so long ago are very carefully guarded. Like his neighbours, Yorgos's life is regulated by these foraging expeditions. In February he digs up the golden thistle Ascolimbi, whose scrubbed roots, said to be an aphrodisiac, taste like artichoke and are served with octopus and lamb. When it rains, he's out at night with a torch fossicking for beige-striped snails that he'll steam and stuff or serve swimming in a sea of red wine. We head out to seek the wild herbs that he'll use to make crisp Kalitsunia pies. Proof that the Mediterranean diet really works, my 80-year-old guide, his body warped like a centennial olive tree, skips nimbly as a satyr along the mountain track ahead of me as he reminisces about wartime Crete. How he wet his pants when a German soldier caught him stealing and booted his skinny buttocks. How painful it was to be hungry. Your belly shrivels like a sucked-out ascamadura, he says, referring to the Cretan equivalent of the Scottish bagpipes. An hour's hard walking leads us high into the Lasiti Mountains, where the ancient Minoans once buried their dead. We squeeze through a narrow passage between two peaks and emerge in a fertile valley strewn with the mauve and green striped bells of Messina fritillary and stabbed with tall pink blades of Italian gladioli. This pointillist canvas, after the long trudge through grey-green hillsides, is dazzling. But Yorgos is already at work. Nail-grimed, banana-bunch fingers clutching a spotted, notched knife, he fills his fibre sack with mustard leaves, dandelion, sorrel and black nightshade. Pausing for breath, he points out freshly dug holes in the surrounding fields where rare orchids have been dug up. We never bothered with them before, but now, tina kaname, what can you do? People dig them up and sell them to collectors. You can feed a family for a month on what they'll pay. Harvest complete, we haul sacks on shoulders and jog back down the hillside. The stolen orchids have made Yorgos angry. It's all the fault of Europe. After we went into Europe in 1981, there was money everywhere, he tells me. My friend's son worked at the bank. He'd call me up and say, "Hey, Yorgos, wouldn't you like a couple of €1,000 to buy a new car?" Of course I did. To me it was free money. I didn't even know what a loan was then. Back at Yorgos's house, we prepare the horta. He lives alone in 2 small rooms with an outside toilet. His wife died 20 years ago, victim of a medical error. Her black-eyed photo dancing at the village festival, feeding her children or harvesting olives, is pinned to every wall. The bubbling horta heats the room with steamy bonfire smells. Yorgos prepares the wild herb drink, rakomeli, mixing the local firewater with honey and heating it over a gas burner. He is still angry. He shows me a recent electricity bill, €180 for 2 months. As a retired farmer, he survives on a pension of €500 a month, but now, as Greece's economic crisis deepens, his pension is to be reduced to €300. He drains the wild herbs and anoints them with olive oil and lemon juice. "Soon this horta is all I will have to eat," he says, as I savour a mouthful of the meltingly textured, mildly astringent greens. "Soon we will return to the ways of our old folks, and it will be hard for us, very hard," he says, crumpling the bill in his earth-stained hand.
And with that from Heidi Fuller-Love on the Greek island of Crete, we've reached the end of another edition. Our next one's on Saturday morning at 5:30.